very short history of world trade, our very short history of Donald Trump's trade war, and then I'll ask in the last slide, what next? So, the essential features of the post-war trading system, which really began in 1947 with the Havana Charter, were the following ideas: non-discrimination, the only exceptions being free trade areas and customs unions, which had very rigorous conditions, liberalization through multilateral negotiations, bound tariffs, and so predictable protection. Inclusion, ultimately, of all countries within this global system, and a very special treatment, however, for developing countries, so-called special and differential treatment. The only countries that could break these rules pretty freely were developing countries, not the most powerful country in the system. The system was, in its own term, as an extraordinary success, and it is now ending. So this is the history of post-war tariffs. This effective tariff rate for the US comes from the Yale Budget Lab, shows the historic rates of protection of the US going back to 1866. And there are 2 points to make. The US was a very protectionist country in the 19th century, which is when Trump thinks everything was perfect. Second, in the 30s, between the 20s and 30s, American protection bounced upwards massively to reach an average protection tariff rate of 20%. And within a couple of months, if these tariffs remain, we're going to go back to that. So you can see a long tariff liberalization after the Second World War and a very sudden spike. And these are the rates as they are today. The last line, or dotted line. I want to put this in a global context, what's happened elsewhere. So this is trade-weighted applied mean tariffs for a whole number of very important developing countries, and also the UK, EU, US, Japan. And the blue block shows the original tariffs as of 2000, the orange shows the 2022 tariffs, and the green is the simple difference. And you can see, crucially, that liberalization up to this moment proceeded rapidly across the entire world. Contrary to Trump's belief that everybody is protecting themselves against the US, the reverse is true. By 2022, average tariffs had converged to a remarkable degree among major economies. And this chart shows what this has meant for world trade, or more importantly, the trade intensity of global GDP. So this goes back to 1820. It shows the ratio of world trade to GDP. There are 2 episodes of globalization. The pre-First World War period, you can see very rapid integration, rises in the world trade ratio, then a complete collapse between the 2 wars, particularly with the Great Depression, and then an absolutely staggering rise from about the 1940s to reach a peak at about 2007. And at that point, the world economy was more open to trade than at any time in its history. It has not collapsed since then, but it has stopped rising. And the crucial point is, if this tariff war becomes general again, with the sort of protection we're seeing in the US, this could collapse. And there is an awfully long way to go because the world economy is now so open. Now let me try to go through Trump's trade war. Trump is trying to blow all this up. His justification is US bilateral and overall deficits, and the outcome has been chaos. So this is, I think, the core of the US complaints, and this is the global current account balances of major states, in fact, all the big states, in 2024. And the key point is everybody, all the larger states run surpluses except the US and to a much lesser degree the UK. The US is essentially the net borrower in the world system, and they really, really don't like it. And they think this is a trade problem, but it isn't, which is a point I think Tony will be talking about later. This is what has happened. I'm not going to go through all this. This just documents 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major tariff policy changes by the US between April the 9th and early May. Every one of them was a significant change. I can't go through them all, but it gives you some sense of the chaos. This is the trade policy of America towards China and China towards the United States between February and the current date. This is the most important bilateral relationships between two countries in the world. You work out what this means for production and trade in the world system. It's complete chaos. Never happened before. Now the question is obviously who is most vulnerable to this. Fortunately, only 2 countries are hugely vulnerable to a trade war with the US. They're Mexico and Canada. This shows the trade exports to the US as a share of GDP, its gross exports. South Korea is pretty dependent. Countries in Europe tend to export about 4% of their GDP to the US. It's significant, but probably just about manageable. And in a trade war between the US and Japan, US and China, a crucial point, which I can't go through, is that China is a hugely significant trading partner for the majority of America's trading partners. In fact, for the majority, China is more important than the US. And that means they're not going to choose. They just won't. So what happens next? Well, up to now, as my brilliant friend Rob Armstrong and colleague has said, Trump always chickens out, which is called the taco trade, if you follow that. The question is, will he always chicken out? Is this roller coaster going on forever? Or will he sometime stick? How, where, and when will the disorder end? Nobody has a clue. Will other countries be able to negotiate effectively with the US? No one so far has. Maybe the UK, but it's not clear. Will other countries retaliate against Trump? And if so, how? Will other countries keep the rest of the WTO system working when the US has been blowing it up? Can anybody, business or governments, trust Trump above all? And that's the most fundamental issue of all. In other words, can you reach a deal people believe in? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You leave a lot of questions in the discussion. I will ask you to give a few answers on that. But first, Tony, please. No, first.
Okay, well, it's very good to be back in Turin. I was at the festival 2 years ago, I think, talking about trade then as well. I think we were worrying about deglobalization, but saying, oh, it's not really happening, it's not a problem. Anyway, obviously trade is the topic of the moment. So what I want to do in these couple of minutes is rehearse the basic effects of tariffs. So very quick, stark run through what we know about the way tariffs actually, well, what they do and what they surely don't do. And then stand back a little bit from that and say, well, you know, there are underlying tensions that have been growing in the world economy for a long time. So just a couple of remarks on what those are and how they might sort of shape things, possibly going forwards. So, not going to be an economics lecture quite, but the economics of tariffs. What do they do? Okay, so I'm calling the US the perp here, the perpetrator. So let's think about what tariffs do to the country imposing, and then what they do to other countries, and then how other countries might respond, which might begin to set up a discussion for later. Well, as Martin has said, a lot of the possible alleged motivation of Trump might be something to do with the deficit. Probably is. But what we do know really is that tariffs have no effect on, or little effect on, reducing the current account deficit. The reason for that is the current account deficit for a country is as it would be for an individual. If you spend more than you earn, you're in deficit, and someone will be lending you the money. So all the equation there says is m minus x equals c plus g plus I minus whatever it is, minus y, for those with a little bit of economics 101. But a really important point, right? If you put on tariffs, does that change aggregate consumption in your country? Well, a tiny bit maybe, but not really. Does it change production, overall aggregate production in the country? Well, if you've got unemployed resources, maybe, but does the US have lots of unemployed labor, unemployed resources? No. So tariff does not really change those two big aggregates or the difference between them. What does it do? Well, within those aggregates, it switches things around. Possibly not very much, but anyway, it's a switching mechanism within those aggregates. So think about it. What tariffs do are going to switch some of the resources you use in your economy, labor and capital, towards import competing sectors. So you're cutting imports, so resources will move that way. And those are the low productivity things in your country, essentially. That's why you're importing them in the first place. Where do the resources come from? Well, you're pulling them out of your export sectors, your high productivity sectors. So you're really pulling resources in exactly the direction you don't want to pull resources, out of your high productivity into your low productivity. So it's not changing the aggregates, it's changing the composition of what's going on in between. Magnitude, subject of a lot of debate. Trump did put tariffs on 7 years ago on steel. Lots of studies of that. There was a bit of an uptick in US steel production, but certainly not US steel employment. That continued to fall, so quantity effect small. Third thing tariffs do, raise some tax revenue for government, and that's certainly running at tens of billions of pounds for the US. But the question is, who actually pays the tax? Well, in general, it's going to be some combination of the foreign import suppliers and the domestic import users, be they final consumers or firms using steel as an intermediate good. So it's going to be some combination of those. But again, the evidence from those earlier steel tariffs is that it was essentially entirely domestic users and domestic consumers who paid the tariff. So you're not actually screwing foreigners, as the president might like to do. You're just taxing your domestic consumers. Okay, that's the effects of the perpetrator on the perpetrator. What about effects on other countries? Okay, obviously a negative impact on suppliers of exports to the US. Surprise, surprise. The more interesting thing to think about is, well, these other countries, the rest of the world is going to react. What are the incentives for them to react? And this is going to be important for a discussion about where the system is going to go, what happens next. Well, they might react by retaliation. If it's successful, good. If it's not, bad. I don't want to say more than that. Will they react by actually other countries? Will it promote trade between other countries? Well, the incentive for doing that is really, your firms have lost export markets, so they're going to put pressure on the governments to go out and make deals and get other export markets. So, okay, that sounds offsetting. That sounds like, well, replacing some trade. Great. But there's a force pulling in the opposite direction, which is trade deflection. So essentially, China's going to be looking for other places to sell its exports. That's going to be the European Union, amongst other places. So the European Union is going to, import competing firms in the European Union are going to be going to Brussels and saying, give us some tariffs. Let's raise tariffs to stop this import deflection coming round. So we've got these two opposing effects, B and C there, and which dominate is really rather important, I think. It's going to vary across sectors, it's going to vary across countries. Obviously, sectors and countries that export a lot to the US will want to go out and do trade deals. Others will just want to stop the Chinese goods being deflected into their country. As I was looking at these slides this morning, I realized there should be a number 3 here as well, which is trade accommodation, which is doing the bilateral deal with Trump. That really should be on this slide. It isn't, but let me just say a couple of words about it. I mean, what do we think that trade accommodation will do? I think there are 2 downsides to it. One is that it's going to make later coordination between rest of the world countries more difficult, because some will have struck deals, others won't, and held out. So it's going to make that more difficult. And that's probably the main downside. Let me leave it at that. Okay, do I have a few more moments? I do. That's the basic economics of tariffs. But of course, overarching all this, the most important effect in the sort of short run, or as we're seeing it now, is surely the uncertainty that Martin has mentioned. We know for sure that investors thinking, where do you build a factory, offices, where do you do it, how do you do it, are going to postpone and maybe be deterred completely. So this damages investment and growth. 2 sorts of uncertainty. There, one I've called Trumpian uncertainty, which is just the chaos. We don't know what's going to happen next week. But another more important fundamental one, an essential part of the world trading system, as Martin has said, is commitment. It's tariff bindings. It's not just changing what you do at a whim. Essentially, it's promise keeping. You join this organization and sign up and keep your promises, and that creates certainty. And economic systems need that if they're going to function. I mean, think, within a country, if you didn't know whether contracts were going to be upheld and enforced, you need that certainty. So it's that destruction of confidence that's so created. Okay, a couple of quick words, though, now switching to a different topic. These underlying drivers of trade tensions. Over the last 10 years, before Trump, there's certainly talk of deglobalization, as I was talking about 2 years ago here, international fragmentation, the WTO losing influence. Why is that? What's changed? Well, a hell of a lot of things has changed. But anything particular to the nature of trade? Because if so, maybe we should sort of rethink trade rules a little bit, go back to fundamentals. Let me just make a couple of points on this. Possible causes of this increasing tension. What I've called here sort of winner-takes-all economics. Obviously, low trade barriers enable specialization. And if you add that to all the clustering, agglomeration, increasing returns to scale forces, what we know now is that a lot of sectors do cluster together in a few places. So some sectors, finance, chip production, operate at a global scale, supply the world market from really rather few places. That gives things a bit of a zero-sum flavor, doesn't it? If one country's got this activity, then somewhere else doesn't. If one country did have it and it's moved, you've lost it. Now, I don't like using the word zero-sum here because it's not strictly zero-sum. There may be aggregate gains from this. But it's it's somehow sort of undermining the idea that there are mutual benefits to everyone from trade. No, I've lost this sector, and I care about quantities, not just about prices. I care about having this sector. So I think, you know, that is a real concern. And certainly if you read Steve Bannon, which I haven't, but I've talked to people who have, the American grievance of the America heartland is mainly due to technology and drugs. But trade, I think, does, you know, this slight zero-sum element does change things. The second cause, okay, well, when that specialization has happened, obviously vulnerability has increased. Vulnerability to natural and economic shocks, vulnerability to conflict. Should conflict emerge and you don't have any activity in munitions manufacture or whatever, then evidently your threat point isn't very good. You're vulnerable. And this is a legitimate concern of policymakers. There was an FT article a couple of weeks ago, I think, about Europe being about to lose its last producer of mass antibiotics. Do we care about that? Well, I think we probably do, right? So these sort of security, vulnerability, resilience arguments, I think, are important. What else has changed? Well, obviously, the rise of China, enabled by the miracle of globalization and the miracle of trade. But undoubtedly, clearly, these shifting tectonic plates have changed the nature of relationships, evidently. So consequences and what next? Consequences, yeah, but the popular grievance, the populism, to some extent, stems, I think, from these changes in the world, the nature of world trade, security concerns, what I sometimes describe as people caring about quantities as much as they care about prices. It's what you do as well as the price you're having to pay for it that really matters, and obviously a pressure to use an unfortunately familiar phrase to take back control arising from this. So underlying causes of tension, I think, and what next? Well, there's managing the mess that we're faced with now, but arguably a system that has performed brilliantly, admirably for whatever it is, 70 years, 80 years, possibly needs some rethinking. Thanks.
So thank you, and you had both a very interesting presentation, discussion, but of course we have a lot of open points to discuss and go on. And I wanted to start with a question to both of you, actually. And it's what's the permanent cost for the US economy of the current situation, and in terms of credibility cost for the US, and how much can this credibility cost be reverted in the medium to long term? We see what's happening on financial market, the US being perceived less of a safe asset. It may be for the fiscal side, but of course there is a lot related to the unpredictability of policies as well. And we see also on the dollar side the same perception coming. And so to me it's really, is it a short-term phenomenon, this loss of credibility? Is it a long-term? And then will it really lead to a transformation of the global system with a more multipolar system or not? Maybe you want to start, Martin?
So there's a very big question to dispose of in a minute or two. So I think my answer is, what the markets are telling me is they don't know the answer to that question, that they're just not quite as sure of things as they were a month or three ago. I've been looking for a column I'm writing at just bond yields, and these are very clearly not at crisis levels. Nothing is screaming at you if you look at the markets and you remove the sort of Liberation Day shock, which was a real shock because nobody really expected that because it was insane and it was big, which is not something you normally expect unannounced. But if you ignore that, the markets have been modestly turbulent, but the stock market is still very high, much better value than any other major stock market. US long bond yields are somewhat higher than conventional yields in Europe, but that's consistent with higher real interest rates, which is consistent with faster growth, and the fiscal position, as you mentioned. But again, it doesn't look radically different from a few months ago. It's clear there's a lot of noise and clearly diversification is going on. But I would think if you look at markets now, these are not screaming the end of the world. So I think it's important not to exaggerate this. Second point, which is a point, and I'll leave it with this. I did a very long, this is a bit of an advertisement, but I did a very long, about 4,000 word interview with Alan Taylor, who is, Tony would agree, one of the more distinguished economic historians in the world, on this question. And he said, which it fits in with, I think, what Tony said, is about, he didn't quote, but there's a very great remark from the founder of the subject, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, Adam Smith. There's a great deal of ruin in a nation. And there's certainly a great deal of ruin in the superpower, right? The US is quite clearly, objectively, the strongest system in the world. I mean, I can go through it all in terms of self-sufficiency, technology, and so forth. So there's a great deal of ruin in the nation. If things are really messed up on trade, fiscal is different. If there's a default, that's something different. Very unlikely. It can survive a lot, but the effects are cumulative. They're long-term. Trade liberalization, we would mostly say, in major countries, doesn't lead to dramatic improvements, and protection doesn't lead to dramatic deterioration. There are cumulative costs associated with all this, to which the unpredictability adds. So in the longer run, decade, 2 decades, if this continues, if it doesn't obviously in a decisive way end, the cost to the US in terms of credibility, domestic and external, link it with all the other changes, the rule of law and so forth, could be very, very damaged for the US. But I don't think it's an overnight thing at all. And if in one way or another they manage to end this nonsense, very big if, I would expect them to have a reasonable chance over sufficiently long to recover confidence. But the longer it goes on for, the more permanent the damage will be, and it will accumulate to something substantial. And if they really damage the US, then it's a profound transformation in the world order.
Yeah. Tony?
Yes, I mean, suppose you're a firm thinking about where to locate a factory. Or suppose you're a country, Mexico or Canada, and thinking of entering a long-term trade arrangement with the United States. You know, what do you do now? Well, the answer is now you do nothing. You wait, but at what point do you actually trust the US that it won't cipher tariff on your products, or just ignore or tear up the trade deal you just did? So these, when you think about sunk investments, big long-run investments, you want confidence that they will last, be able to serve the market, shape your economy for decades possibly. So a loss of confidence can be very, very expensive.
And I have a bit of I put another question and a bit of a story behind that. In April, I was going to the IMF annual meetings, and I was trying to meet as many as possible of the economic advisor of Trump's. And then in the discussions, it was quite interesting. Some of them, the most important ones, I don't say the exact names, they were tariff, what we wanted to achieve, the current account, etc. One of the close circle, the one that I found the most interesting, actually was saying, look, the US external policy is not changed so much from Trump 1. What is changing now is the way in which things are done. And now there is an attempt to have a complete shock disruption. And with this complete shock disruption, see if we can shift into a parallel world with some short-term cost, where the parallel world is a parallel world in which we have more security, if you want, more industrial production, etc., the whole story. But the other point is we isolate somehow China on the technology front. What do you think? For me, that was the convincing guy, the one that was telling really the strategy behind. What do you think about all these leading in terms of complete polarization in the world, US, China? Will the policy bring to that, and what should be the rational response for their countries?
Well, my reaction to that, and I think I've written this, though I can't remember all that I've written, is that if that were your objective, I'll be fairly brief on this, nobody who isn't a lunatic would do it in the way that they're doing it. Because what they're saying is, our objective is to have a world in which China is isolated. Isolating China, from the point of view of most of the world, I've got one chart there that showed this, is very costly. Because China is a seriously important trading partner and a seriously important supplier of inputs to most of the world. And that's particularly true not for the countries represented here, but for the whole of Asia, which is, please remind ourselves, more than half of humanity. We are the periphery. Asia is the core. Right? This is very important to understand. For Asia, China is overwhelmingly the most important trading partner, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. Even for India, it's an enormously important partner. The US is still more important. So you're asking them to isolate China, which is not only an enormous important economic power, but is a rising superpower, which is next door. And to do that, a necessary condition, I will not even begin to say sufficient, is total trust in the US. When Europe, and we had no choice in the 40s and 50s, a period I remember, the 50s, united with America against the Soviet Union, a necessary condition for that unity, and the traction, the incentive was pretty great if you think about it, was trust in the US. Vis-a-vis China, they have to trust the US. So they're going to start this off by attacking all their allies. The only thing America has demonstrated is that its alliances are absolutely untrustworthy. And they demonstrated this beautifully, many other ways, by attacking, of all countries on earth, Canada. Now, if you are attacking a dependent country, a close friend with whom you have had no competition of serious conflict for almost 2 centuries, and which has been by your side in every war you fought, what you're saying is you are absolutely untrustworthy. So my view is that any country that chooses the US over China under Trump is crazy.
That's Tony, your view?
It's uncomfortable for advanced nations when they lose a sector to, the car industry leaves Turin and goes somewhere else. But it is an absolute moral necessity that the world trading system leaves open the route, facilitates the route by which countries can move up a value chain, can raise productivity, and produce commodities that will, activities that will give them the same sort of income levels that we enjoy in the developed world. So the idea that you isolate China and Vietnam and anywhere that's getting a bit uppity, we don't give them technology. A world trading system really cannot have that anywhere in its precepts. But it's uncomfortable for us, and domestic policy, intelligent things in the domestic economy have to be developed to handle these difficult transitions. But you don't do it through trade policy and through what's going on.
I fully agree with you. I think that's also economics as we studied it. But I think it's also very challenging because of politics in many of the countries, as you are saying, is actually quite ambiguous on the role of the globalization, on the effect on economy and society. So actually it enters, the whole policy enters in a very difficult situation. And in Europe as well, we are discussing on which are the strategic technologies that we should really protect and which are not strategic technologies, where strategic technologies also for economic security, etc., which we should protect, and which one are the ones where we just want to benefit from globalization. But I think it's going to be a very difficult and granular discussion going on, particularly with politics in many of the countries. But I think Europe, like other countries in the world, have the same point.
Well, what I just to follow on that, because I think Tony will have a lot to say on this point too. Sorry, I apologize. So it seems to me, what I was saying earlier, that there's no way we're going to get the rest of the world to round on China at the behest of this US. There is a question, of course, for the developed world, which I think the Biden administration, by and large, approached quite rationally, which is, Tony was saying this, there are sectors which have strategic significance because they are, in some sense, pretty obviously vital. Defense equipment is obviously one, the most advanced technologies which underpin the whole systems we run, the whole cyber world and all the rest of it. Pharmaceuticals, it's pretty clear. And I think it is completely reasonable for countries to say, these things we wish to preserve. And for the reasons that Tony laid out, economics would say the transparent way and the most efficient way, because you don't want to have anti-trade bias, you don't want to penalize exports, particularly the sectors you're protecting, the rational way is to subsidize them. You can also have some domestic procurement requirements. I think that's completely reasonable. And that was what the Biden administration proposed to do. And they had a reasonably rational list, I think, of the things they wanted to protect. I actually have had a lot of conversation on this subject with Chinese people, and they understand that because they do the same thing. So that's not a problem if you do it that way. But that's not what Trump is doing. You can't work out not only the instability, what is the rationale if you're from a security point of view. Let's give these one example of protecting steel. The sector, getting steel is a commodity. Lots of people make steel. It's not all China. But the steel using sectors are the value-added sectors. So with the steel tariff, he's taxing every steel-using industry. That's an anti-security policy, including military equipment. So there's no intellectual coherence. He's abolished all the subsidies, as far as I can see, Biden has introduced. The CHIPS Act seems to be on the verge of death. So the huge program to build semiconductors in the US is going. And crucially, and this is one point that's very important in this Fortress America thing, this is one of the things I think the Americans really don't understand. They are no longer the world's dominant market. So I had a fun one point I made in a column, which is quite interesting. It's about electric vehicles. Now, electric vehicles are rather important. I don't think I need to come to Torino to say that. What is the dominant market for electric vehicles in the world? China. Half of the world's consumption, purchase of electric vehicles is in China. If we protect our markets, the US is a quarter. The US market isn't big enough to build an electric vehicle producing industry which will rival China, which has twice as big a market. And in many goods, that's already the case. And it will continue to get worse. So a protectionist strategy to become world leading, which is based on the domestic market, is in many cases, when dealing with China, which they're not going to isolate, going to fail.
I think one of the very difficult things here is where you draw the line, right? We can all agree on offense and antibiotics and security stuff. Cars, did Draghi get it right, or has he just got too long a list? I mean, it's important to remember that one of the strengths of the current world trading system, the tariff bindings and all the regulations, are to give governments a bulwark against lobbying by domestic industries. Every industry will go to government and say, oh, we're essential for jobs in this area or national security or this or that. So this is a problem that we can solve. But it is a problem. How do you design rules that say certain things, industrial policy, subsidy, not trade policy, but subsidies are fine. Other things they're not. That's going to be very difficult to navigate. I mean, some people would say, well, WTO rules at present, we can bend them. R&D is outside and environment is outside security, so we can just push up against those limits. I think it needs a bit more of a fundamental rethink on where we sort of put that line. I don't know the answer, but it's a problem.
I think I would like to take some questions from the floor. Yes, I see one. Yeah, but maybe the streaming doesn't hear him. Okay, can you wait at the micro?
Thank you. So I'll start again. Donald Trump doesn't know what he's doing. We don't know what he's going to do next. A former prime minister of yours, Liz Truss, lasted 45 days and she was punished by the financial markets. Why doesn't this apply to Trump?
Oh, that's very simple. It's the Constitution, damn it. The US doesn't have a parliamentary system. One of the beauties of a parliamentary system is if you don't control the majority in the House of Parliament, you're gone. And we've done this very often. So losing a prime minister between elections is quite a standard feature of British politics and has been for a very long time. Now, Liz Truss was rather extreme because she was extreme. She lost the confidence of her own party. The president, on the other hand, and I quote from Alexander Hamilton's federal paper on the presidency, which I read 8 years ago for a column I wrote on how, in 2016, how Donald Trump might end the American Republic. The presidency, according to Alexander Hamilton, was modeled, and I think in this audience you will all immediately understand what that means, on the Roman dictatorship. I don't mean the imperial, the empire, I mean the Roman dictatorship. This was a person who was head of government, head of state, and had extraordinary executive power embodied in him for as long as he remained president, which is for a term. The only way you can get rid of a president if he doesn't want to go, and is to make it credible that he will be convicted in an impeachment. And of course, there have been many impeachments against Trump, and since you need a two-thirds majority in the Senate, at no stage has it come close to that. This is the really important difference. Under Richard Nixon in the early 70s, there was an impeachment process in which it became absolutely obvious that Republicans were going to vote against Nixon. And it was because that became, in sufficient numbers, that became obvious, he had to resign. In current American politics, it is proved impossible to get any significant number of Republicans in any circumstance to vote against Donald Trump, which itself shows a profound transformation of the party system, of Congress, and for that reason, Trump is completely secure.
Yes, please.
To any of you, but thank you. What do you say to the economists who are perhaps more alarmist about Trump's policies, but perhaps also give more credit to his court economists? That is, Trump as a sort of anti-Nixon shock to force foreign central banks to either to reduce dollar holdings, adjust domestic interest rates, as we've already seen, to, according to many, essentially subsidize the inflation that would occur through tariff revenues and dollar devaluation.
Martin's the finance and macro guy.
Okay. The argument, I found it really very difficult to work out precisely the model of the world they introduce. The Nixon shock, which I lived through, I wrote about, believe it or not, because I was working at the World Bank at that time. There are some advantages in being very old, I've decided. You've had a very specific and concrete aim, which was to break the people's the other country, break the link between the dollar and gold. That was not sufficient in his view because he wanted the trading partners to accept a very substantial depreciation of the dollar, which was more or less bound to happen once he did this. But the tariffs that he imposed imports surcharges, reinforced this, and he moved the system to generalized floating. So there was a systemic outcome, not completely clear that they understood this fully, but it happened really quite quickly, and they got a very large depreciation. It's a very substantial depreciation. They also completely destabilized monetary order in the US and generated a 12-year, roughly 12-year inflation, which took an enormous recession to solve. So it is an open question whether this was truly a very successful policy, but it was relatively clear and coherent. The problem with this lot is it's not clear to me, one, that Trump understands this policy at all, which is supposedly in his name. In fact, it's pretty clear he doesn't. Two, it's not even clear that Stephen Moran and Scott Bessent have the same policy, at least not to me on the basis of what I've read. And I really don't understand what the end state is that they envisage. They seem to imagine some sort of permanent commitment to an appreciated, a depreciated dollar, whose inflationary consequences for the US are ameliorated by the willingness of these countries to buy even larger amounts of just depreciated US dollar bonds ad infinitum. That's not the sort of commitment that any serious country is ever going to make. The closest to that was the Plaza Accord, and that lasted a couple of years, and that was over. So they're trying to create, as far as I can, a systemic long-term support of an insolvent US as a core policy of the rest of the world. Dream on. I mean, it's just, anyone who knows anything, every serious international finance person I know, and I've talked about this with most of them, Ken Rogoff, for example, it's just laughable, sorry. I mean, specific targeted interventions to achieve specific targeted objectives over time limits to a new system you can imagine. In those cases you can imagine, I think they were all very dangerous, but that's another matter. But I just don't see what the end games looks like.
I have myself another question that I wanted to pose to the two of you, maybe starting with Tony this time. If the superpower is gradually, and we understand it will be a gradual process, but lose weight in the global economy, where can we end up? Who could gain? And there is a lot of talking, I know we had a conversation already, there is a lot of hope Europe may take it over, but what would be, I know that you are not convinced on that, but what could be the condition under which Europe could take it over? And who are the other countries that could gradually become more important in the global spectrum? Tony, can I ask the visionary view?
Okay, well, let's think this through in the sort of short to medium run rather than the very long run. So what are the possible outcomes? I mean, one is sort of chaos and financial collapse and, the 1930s. Another is globalization continuing pretty much as is, but without the US, or with the US choosing to join in or not, as may be the case. And then we're going to end up presumably somewhere, hopefully somewhere well, not hopefully, most likely between those two cases. So what do we think is going to happen? There'll be some bilateral deals put together between countries other than the US. So that's that force I talked about, that you lose export markets, so you do try and put together deals. So I guess the question you're getting at is, well, if you think of a group of, if you think of countries doing that, then do they do it in a coordinated way? Do they do it such that a bloc emerges? How big is that bloc? Does it include China? No. So there's a view, certainly, of a sort of three-block world. I think my own view is that the amount of coordination between these, the like-minded group, Europe, Japan, whatever, is going to be less than we would hope to see, because of the complications of that deflection that I talked about earlier. The EU has tariffs on EVs, which will hurt the UK car industry. So the ripples, the implications are going to make it quite difficult for this coordinated central player to emerge. So I suppose I see it as the US, China, and then a rather sort of mushy, formless group in between, making progress with rather ad hoc arrangements. Hopefully, but probably not, coming together to something more cohesive and structured.
And can I add a piece of question? What happens to the Global South in all of this?
That's an extremely good question. How many hours do we have? So let me go at this from a different way, which fits with what Tony said. Is there a replacement for the US? And the answer to that is no. People have talked about the interwar period in this regard, though I think it's a poor parallel, but it's the least bad one, which was a period when the UK was clearly incapable of maintaining global economic or European political order, and the US was somewhere else. It voted down the League of Nations and withdrew. And this didn't go well. I think we can safely say this didn't go well. So it's a pretty frightening precedent. The situation as I see it is if we want a hegemon, which is a benign provider of order, economic and strategic, then probably, for all its faults, the US was the least bad imaginable. First of all, it was definitively a hegemon. It was the biggest single economy, the most advanced technology. It's strategically as invulnerable as you can be in a nuclear world, given that it has a moat 10,000 miles in one direction and 4,000 miles in the other direction, and South America is not a great power, nor is Canada. So, and it was seen by most countries in the world as relatively trustworthy. Not perfectly, but relatively trustworthy. And it had, because of these qualities, also far and away the most powerful financial markets and currency, which was certainly seen as trustworthy. Can any other place replicate that on that scale? No. China is economically big enough. It's a closed economic system. It is, to put it mildly, though a real necessity, real vital element of the world system, not highly trusted. You can go around and talk to people privately about it. And the Chinese are desperate to avoid a situation in which their financial system and economy is at the mercy of global forces. And that's why the RMB is not a globally traded currency. Europe has the advantage, a relative advantage, a market economy, relatively open and all the rest of it, relatively trusted, I say, but it is not strategically powerful, and it is very, very far from becoming so. It isn't a state, it doesn't have the power of a coherent state, and doesn't seem very likely to get it. Its financial markets are not integrated, its debt markets are not integrated, and technologically, it's falling behind. So it's not a replacement for the US. Could it become so? Well, not in my lifetime, but then I'm an old man. Now, and those are the only two rivals. In the very long run, 50, 60 years, in terms of numbers, India clearly has potential. It's going to have 2 billion odd people. That's a pretty big place. So I would say we're moving from a hegemonic position to a strategic disorder. Where does the South fit into this? Well, there are two things going on here which I think really, really important. It depends what you mean by the South. The trading South, the countries that are rising, that are prospering, mostly in Asia, will do the deals they can with the people they can do. And many of them won't do that badly because their peoples want better lives, and they know roughly how to do it. So if you think about Indonesia or India, most of Southeast Asia, they, I think, will find a way of dealing with this, unless we get a war between China and the US, which is a non-zero possibility, obviously. Follow Taiwan. Then you've got I'm not going to go into Latin America because I think it won't matter either way. I think it'll be okay because the Americans will ensure that it will, and the Chinese will. But they're not going to do very well for structural reasons, which I can't go into. Then you've got the real South, most of which is Africa, but also Pakistan to some degree. What we are seeing now is a systemic turning away from aid, a systemic turning away from liberal trade. And violent disruption of the supportive process. Think of the war on the World Health Organization and so forth. And nobody really cares about these countries. So I've written several pieces because of my history working for the World Bank. I worked on Africa for some years. I'm very, very concerned what's going to happen to what I think of as the true global South, the non-BRIC global South. And I think the future, I've just received the latest Global Economic Prospects paper from the World Bank, and the picture it paints of FDI, for example, to these countries, it's collapsing, completely collapsing. Aid is collapsing. We're going to have defaults and terrible misery, and I think it's a crime.
I fully share your concern. I think we are a bit over time, but we kept our 1 hour. I don't want to end with this negative, depressive image, and I know that you will not like it, but is there one thing that you can see as a positive going forward?
My positive view, I think there is a possibility that the world might unite because Trump will force them to. Because one thing we all share is we can't live with this. And that means we depend more on one another, which is a form of maturation. And Europe will have to lead here, and the Americans will have to realize that they can, of course, damage the world, but the world won't allow itself to be blown up. And that could be quite maturing. We have relied on the US for too long, and now we can't, so we'll have to rely on ourselves.
No, that's a good image. I think we are trying from the European side to try to unite more and more, and there is also more talk with the UK. So that's a possibility. Tony, on your side?
Well, I was just thinking it's really rather sad if you think that to reach the best outcome of Trumpism being defeated, things are going to have to get a lot worse in the US first. So that's not exactly possible. It's a bad way to a positive outcome.
Yeah, that's true. But thank you very much. I think it has been a fantastic discussion.
Gentili ospiti, benvenuti. Il Festival Internazionale dell'Economia vorrebbe conoscere la vostra opinione